Hello, students. To introduce you to the topic of the subaltern, let me first of all invite your attention to a book, the cover page of which I have put up on this slide for you. The book is Turning the Pot, Tilling the Land, Dignity of Labor in Our Times, written by Kancha Ilaya. This book, specifically written for children, has as its objective inculcating a sense of the dignity of labor in uh, the children and in building a rational, scientific, democratic India. The 11 chapters in this book deal with various traditional occupations, which have been pursued by people for centuries. The Adivasis, the cowherds, the goat herds, the farmers, the potters, the weavers, and so on. Now, the knowledge that we have acquired as a result of their work, as a result of their occupation for centuries, is quite immense. But we hardly ever give them any respect, or we do not consider their work as significant or respectable enough. On the other hand, it is the white collar jobs that are treated with a great deal of respect in our country. We tend to give importance only to jobs and occupations that come with a professional degree attached. And the workers, who work at the ground level, the ones who do the cleaning, the ones who do the tilling of the land, the ones who do the farming, and so on, they are always marginalized. It is in this context that he says in this book, let me read a few sentences from the work. Labor is the lifeblood of civilizations. If labor is neglected, the cancer of laziness develops in every society. In India, the laboring communities have been humiliated, and those who do not do laborious work enjoy a high status. Because of this negative attitude towards labor, the laboring class were treated as untouchables. If the labor was more difficult and a greater number of people benefited by such labor, the caste was made more untouchable. We therefore see that those who clean the drains, the roads, and those who dispose dead animals in villages, those who look after the cattle, those who shave human heads and wash people's clothes are not only disrespected but are paid very low wages. Sometimes they are not even paid at all. So, this kind of attitude towards labor, towards work, creates the kind of division in society which is made very well evident in the other picture that I have pasted on this slide for you. It is, as you can guess, an image of the city of Bombay, where you have the metropolis on the one hand, and in the lower part of the photograph, you can see the slums. The point is, we think only of the sky-rise buildings, the skyscrapers, and everything connected with the metropolis as signifying development, hardly taking into consideration the fact that it is a labor of those who live in the slums, Dharavi in this context, that keeps the development going. For every high rise building that you see there, you have the work of countless laborers behind it. But this is hardly ever reckoned or taken into consideration. And that precisely is the problem we discuss when we talk about the subaltern. The term subaltern, which we today use to designate the underprivileged, the unrepresented, the marginalized, and the voiceless, was actually originally used in the context of the British Army. It was a term that was used to designate a rank lower than that of the captain, somebody like the second lieutenant, for instance. And therefore, the term began to acquire the meaning of somebody or something of a lower stature. And this sense of the term was made more popular with its use by the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci, who, in his prison notebooks, used the term to refer to the politically uncoordinated, unorganized masses. You know, the working classes, people of the working classes, the peasants who were so unorganized and who, Gramsci insisted, ought to be organized by the left wing intellectuals into a politically self conscious force. Now, the term subaltern studies is something that is used to designate the work of a group of Indian scholars who described a variety of approaches to the situation of South Asia, in particular during the colonial and post colonial era. It was a radical group of scholars who attempted to articulate and give voice to the struggles of the oppressed peasants of the Indian subcontinent, whose contribution had never been recorded in historiography, in Indian history. So that is the sense in which we understand the term subaltern studies. So, the Subaltern Studies group was actually a group of Indian scholars trained in Western universities, particularly in England, and whose primary aim was to reclaim history, both from its colonial and post colonial elitist roots. Now, these scholars believed that in spite of independence having been achieved by most of the colonies, the hangover of the era of imperialism was still so heavy that it continued to exert cultural and economic hegemony over the former colonies. So much so that everything, including the writing of history, was overshadowed by the period of colonization. They believed that history, was so Eurocentric in its orientation, and they particularly, were opposed to the Cambridge school of historians who seemed to uphold the elitist colonial legacy. And these scholars therefore got together and they published a series of journal articles, which were published by the Oxford University Press around the year 1982. The primary leader of this group was Ranajit Guha, who had done quite a bit of work in the field of peasant uprisings in India. There are many other scholars involved in this group, and the name of Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak is to be mentioned in a specific manner. So their aim was to give a voice to the voiceless through these articles which rewrote history. Their aim was to create historiography or history that did not merely reconstruct imperialist hegemony. In other words, they wanted to give a representation to all those voices which had been totally marginalized. When the Europeans wrote history, the history of India, they naturally wrote in a way that justified all that they had done, glorified the imperial regime, and totally sidelined the Indian voice. Now, when the country became independent and you had the emergence of Indian scholars, the nationalists among the forefront of them, in the forefront among them, that the historiography that accompanied independence also was elitist. It was something that glorified the contributions of the political leaders, the intellectuals, and generally the people belonging to the Brahminical upper classes, so much so that the voices of the peasants, the workers, the laborers were all totally suppressed or silenced. So, Subaltern Studies conceives of history as unconventional, history against the grain, history against the conventional and traditional norms. It is something that challenges the possibility of any single master narrative, which always glorifies the contributions only of certain classes and categories of people towards history. The kings, the emperors, the colonizers, the white people, the rich, the elite, the people belonging to the higher classes and castes of society. And conventional history is something that has totally overlooked the contributions made by anyone who does not belong to any of these privileged classes. And that would include the workers, the laborers, the peasants, the tribal people, the forest dwellers, the Adivasis, women, the black people, people belonging to the lowest classes and categories and castes of society. So, traditional history has not taken into consideration the contributions made by these sections, and that is what the subaltern historians wanted to challenge. So, rather than accepting the possibility of a conventional kind of narrative which is singular, which is unitary, which is linear, and which has a kind of unity given to it. Here is history that looks at history from multiple perspectives, that looks at the contributions of various people and classes to what we understand as history. So it is history is not a unified, unitary narrative when it comes to subaltern studies, but history is pluralistic, it is fragmented, it is non unitary, it is non essentialist, and it is definitely more inclusive. Therefore, an awareness of the silencing of the subaltern is significant in any society and in any branch of knowledge. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who can be considered as one of the eminent subaltern thinkers, calls this kind of erasure as an epistemic violence, violence that is inflicted through thought, through speech, through writing, rather than physical violence or physical harm. So when oppressed people are not allowed to speak for themselves or to have their contributions recognized, they are erased from their place in the world. And this is especially common for subaltern women. As Spivak says in her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? If, in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. Women are silenced by both colonialism and patriarchy. Spivak combines Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction to highlight the oppression caused by differences in power, gender, and access to knowledge. The significance of this essay, this work, is in the way that it critiques, in a self um, interrogative manner, subaltern studies itself. Spivak is acutely aware of the difficulty and dangers of assuming to speak for the subalterns. She is aware of her own position as an intellectual in who tries to speak for the subalterns. She concludes that the subaltern cannot speak. This is because they are always spoken for by those in positions of power, and therefore they are never able to represent themselves. The intellectuals, both the privileged, the Western, the colonial on the one hand, and even those on the other hand who claim to champion the cause of the underprivileged, of the marginalized, play a role in silencing subaltern voices. So she argues that it is not enough simply to let the subaltern speak from their subaltern position. What we need to do is to rethink the structures of power. It could be the colonial structure of power, it could be the intellectual structure of power, it could be the government machinery, it could be the economic structure of power, it could be patriarchy, whatever the structure of power, it needs to be dismantled. And so the end, and therefore, that's the only way in which we can prevent the exclusion of some members of the society, uh, which is what creates subalterns in the first place. So, that is the significance of subaltern studies.